Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy. What's up, Patricia?
Hey, Greg.
Rick Jackson has made his Rags to Riches biography a centerpiece of his campaign. But Keisha Lance Bottoms has a deeply personal story of her own. The former Atlanta mayor and Democratic nominee for governor is the mother of 4 adopted children, and she sat down with Patricia just the other day to talk about the family she built and the experiences that shaped her long before she entered politics. Let's take a listen.
I always assumed it would be an addition to having biological children, but my body had other thoughts. So when I experienced our journey in trying to conceive, I had fibroids for years and more than a dozen surgeries, and we had undergone infertility treatments, 3 rounds of IVF, and everything that was available to us at that time. And it opened up this pathway to another way to becoming parents. And I say with all of the physical and emotional anguish that we experience, I'd do it all over again if it got me back to these 4.
So, Greg, I approached Keisha Lance Bottoms for this interview. This is not something that she talks about on the campaign trail. Although I have been, as you know, and I think our audience knows, I've been so struck by Rick Jackson's story, how emotional he gets talking about his story of living in an abusive home in Atlanta's Techwood Homes, and then going into the foster care system for many years, and then eventually, I believe he was legally adopted by a family. I know he certainly lived with a specific family for many years after that. And when he talks about it, he gets incredibly emotional. He cries during his rallies, or even during speeches, or during Q&As. It really doesn't matter the setting. And so that is a piece that it's impossible not to see that about Rick Jackson. And in reading Keisha Lance Bottoms' book, she has a new book out, a memoir that you've spoken about. I did not realize that she has her own adoption story, and specifically, she adopted all 4 of her children. I've seen her children on the campaign trail. I think we remember them from the time she was mayor. She talks about them quite a bit, but obviously as a mom. But I did not realize that she and Rick Jackson share this really unique personal experience with adoption. He came at it from one experience, she came at it from another. But to me, it is kind of crazy that our 2 nominees have this really deeply personal connection that they definitely did not know about each other before this campaign began. So that's why I reached out to her to talk about this, and she was happy to talk about it.
Yeah, and she does talk about her kids a lot on the campaign trail, but in different contexts, right?
Yeah.
I was at an event with her just a few days ago where her son was in the front row, her oldest son, and she was bringing him up in terms of, hey, when you go vote, she was telling the people in the room, make sure you do what I asked my son to do, which is vote all the way down the ticket, right? Don't just vote at the top and then ignore the down ballot races, because my son, she was ribbing her son a little bit, might have had that problem, in past elections. So, we hear the story of her family, but what did you learn during this conversation about the story of who she was and why her path to motherhood? Yeah,
well, I learned that she is, I knew this about her. I had not really seen it demonstrated as much. She is very religious. She really struggled with her faith during this process. And anybody who's been through IVF and adoption knows it is so incredibly hard, time-consuming, difficult. It is an emotional roller coaster. And so many times people still go through the process and they leave brokenhearted. It doesn't turn out the way they wanted it to. And so I asked her about her struggle with her faith going through this. And here's what she said. This is clip number 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was so torn, and I went through a period of being hurt, being angry, and just not understanding why God had done that to me. And makes me a little emotional. But my grandmother used to always say it always works for your good. And I sometimes look at my kids and I remember that journey and the years of trying to conceive and the heartbreak and like, God, like, why me? Why me? And then there's the physical pain of it. I had really bad fibroids and.
Patricia, this was her talking about, trying to conceive and then taking the adoption route. And it's something that, yes, she wrote about in her book. And yes, of course, we've heard general, broader discussion about adopting her kids, but this was the first interview I've ever heard where she goes in depth about it.
Yeah, and to give a little bit of the backstory, after going through IVF, her husband started the adoption process with paperwork and said, if you don't want to do this at some point, of course, we can always pull back. But then, and they went through what all families, individuals, or couples go through with adoption. You put in an application, you hope it works. Sometimes it doesn't. Eventually they did get a call, and it was for their first son, Langston, who was in Mississippi. They traveled to Mississippi, and there were all kinds of bureaucratic, I don't want to call it hoops, because it's crucial to have properly vetted, obviously, homes for children to go into. But it really was this very long journey. And in some ways, she said that adoption was even harder than IVF. But kind of going back to her faith, she said she really relied on it and said it all worked out the way it needed to. Here's that in clip number 4.
For me, going back to that faith piece, I went through a period of thinking if we agreed to adopt, it meant that I had forsaken my faith, that somehow I had given up on motherhood. And for anybody who's going through that journey, just reminding them that there are all sorts of roads and pathways and twists and turns that can lead you to being a parent. And I truly believe it always works out just as it should. And I know that was the case for us.
So they ended up, as I mentioned, adopting 4 children, not just once, but it's actually 3 adoptions. The first was Langston, then Lance, and then Lincoln and Lennox are their 2 twins. One of them is a girl, and Lincoln ended up introducing Keisha Lance Bottoms at the first rally that we went to for Jon Ossoff and Bottoms. And she said that her kids are sort of like of varying degrees of interest in this campaign. She's that Lincoln, she said, is actually a little bit shy and had this sort of breakout moment at the rally where people were cheering her on and, said she looked like a natural. The boys were sort of semi-interested, a little bit less so. But it's just, it's very clear that this is a really tight nuclear family that they've got. A part of our interview, I asked her if learning that Rick Jackson had been through his own situation with adoption, if that changed what she thought about Rick Jackson in any way. And here is what she said about that. It's clip number 2.
It humanizes him, of course, and going through the foster care system, I would imagine, can't be easy on anyone. There's so many challenges that people have already faced even before children are placed in the foster care system. So it's for me, it's a reminder that we all have a story, whether we publicly share that story or not.
Yeah, Patricia, to me, this reminds us too that there's these candidate histories, these biographies, these backstories. They're not just abstract notions. They tell us who these people are that we're voting on for the highest offices of Georgia, and also what shaped them to become the men and women they are today. So when Rick Jackson tries to connect with voters by talking about his history, his childhood, when Keisha Lance Bottoms talks about her struggles to motherhood and struggles to raise 4 kids, it humanizes, and that's important, but it also helps us sort of hone the notion of who they will be if we elect them to the Georgia's most important position.
That's right. And I am always looking to see why candidates are running, what motivates them. This is such a hard thing to do, to run a statewide campaign. It completely flips your whole world upside down. Are they doing it kind of for sheer power? Are they doing it to elevate themselves? Are they doing it for kind of a higher purpose? What makes them tick?
Are they doing it to stop the other guy?
Absolutely, right? Yeah. Are they doing it to stop the other guy? Are they doing it because this is just their job and they've been doing it for so long? This is the next thing they're supposed to run for. And so, to me, it's crucial to know why somebody's doing this. You get a lot of clues along the way. I think we get those clues from Jackson on the stump. And for Bottoms, this interview kind of just revealed more about her. We've seen her in the public eye so much, and I've just never really talked to her in this way or seen her in this way. And I do think it can do a disservice to voters if we cover these candidates just like charts and graphs and numbers and dollars. And we want to know who they are, because you are going to have events in office that you never predicted. And I think Bottoms has seen that firsthand. None of us know what's going to happen in these people's terms, and to know as much as you can about them and why they're doing this is essential. And I think that's part of what I see the role of my column, really, if you want to know. But then I think also with both of these candidates, I think we can rest assured that the next governor will be paying a lot of attention to the foster care system here in Georgia.
I'll get to that in a second. But Patricia, before we get to that part of your interview, there was this one in the clip we played a couple minutes ago, this one phrase where Mayor Bottoms said, it meant, I went through a period of thinking if we had agreed to adopt, it meant that I had forsaken my faith.
Yeah.
And to me, that was so powerful, because it does epitomize, it does encapsulate the struggles so many families have had about that decision. You know, for some it's easier than others. But she told you in very raw terms that struggle she had with her own faith, and then how, coming out on the other end of it, how she realized that is what God always intended for her.
Yeah, and I think the way she described it, if she had prayed so much to have children one way, and if she moved on to do it a different way, was that giving up on what she'd prayed for? Was that giving up on God? But looking back, she said this was in her thinking all God's plan to bring these 4 children into her life this way. I have never known anybody who adopted 4 children. And that is really something to do, especially twins, since I'm a mom of twins, just to take all that on. She said, they talk, of course they talk with their children about this. She said, I never wanted my children to know their story without them knowing she didn't want the world to know their story without them knowing their story first. And she said, she said, I tell them, you were chosen, you should be proud, you were special. And that's what makes this family unique.
And one way or another, we know whoever wins, there's going to be major changes to Georgia's foster care system, to Georgia's early childhood system. And here's what Mayor Bottoms told you about how she would address Georgia's troubled foster care system.
Yeah, the stories are heartbreaking. And, we're talking about our most vulnerable population, our children. And there are a lot of factors at play. A lot of families can't afford to foster children anymore. Our caseworkers are saying we're underpaid, we're overworked. There's a decades-long financial issue that, very recently a huge deficit, I believe around $80 million. So there are layers of challenges there. And it's an issue that the state needs to address once and for all. It's not going to be an easy fix, but we've got to get to the root causes of the challenges in this system. Is it just a funding issue? Is it a training issue? Is it all of the above? And I believe when we address those root challenges, then we can have a system that's sustainable and that's best serving our families.
So those are her ideas for the foster care system. She also says she would change parts of the adoption system. It is so incredibly difficult, and it's wildly expensive in many cases that there are changes she would make as well. Rick Jackson has also spoken from the stump, and he's asked about it. How would you change the foster care system? He has a nonprofit that supports that work. I know he has his own changes. We've reached out to the Jackson campaign. I'm talking to them about sitting down with him to talk about his own story as well. And so hopefully if we are able to get that scheduled, we'll bring that here to our listeners as well.
So look out for Patricia's column, for her video on the Bottoms campaign, and of course with Rick Jackson as well. Patricia, let's take a quick break. When we come back, let's dive deeper into the campaign for governor and a massive ad buy that Rick Jackson's campaign just announced. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy. Before we move on, a very quick note. Politically Georgia is powered by subscribers to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. If you already subscribe, thank you. And if you don't, you can join us at ajc.com/start. You'll get full access to our reporting, analysis, subscriber newsletters, and special events throughout the year. That's ajc.com/start. Rick Jackson already spent more than $108 million of his own money winning the Republican nomination for governor. Now the billionaire is reaching into his fortune again, reserving $87 million in fall advertising. It's a buy so enormous it could reshape not only his race against Keisha Lance Bottoms, but really campaigns up and down Georgia's ballot. During a stop in Thomasville, Jackson offered a preview of what that money could buy. His campaign says it has two main tasks. A, he wants to remind voters about the problems Atlanta faced during Bottoms' tenure as mayor. And B, he wants to introduce his own rags to riches biography to the many Georgians who still somehow don't know about it. I say somehow because those ads were like inescapable during the primary season. So let's break down Jackson's $87 million bet, Bottoms' plans to counter it, and why this advertising arms race could affect every major campaign in Georgia. Starting with $87 million, it's a huge amount. Patricia, I know there were some like rumors out there. I don't know who put them out there. I didn't really ever buy it that Rick Jackson was going to, not dip into his fortune as aggressively this phase. It never made sense to me because here is someone who's spent already more than 9 figures to get this far, to help him get this far. So, he's not going to just be relying on the good-hearted nature of donors. Certainly he's going to amp up his fundraising. He already has. But this shows a willingness to keep digging into that personal fortune.
Honestly, if I'm a donor and Rick Jackson walks in and said, "Hey, I just spent $87 million, but I would appreciate your contribution," I think I would be like, Rick... Rick, you've got it handled. I trust you. It's very hard for people this wealthy to also raise money from other people who are not this wealthy. But that's the campaigns. That's for them to deal with. Okay, $87 million. There's no way to describe what that's going to mean to this race because it's totally unprecedented. We can tell and warn our listeners, you will now be seeing Rick Jackson in your mail. This is, first of all, your mailboxes. This doesn't even count for what's coming to your mailboxes. And we know that's going to be the famous concierge service for Georgia voters. This will be a digital buy. This will be just top to bottom all day long, every newscast, every sporting event, whenever, the Super Bowl is not happening between now and then, but if it were, it sure would be there too. Definitely, I would count on every Georgia game to be just doused and smothered in Rick Jackson ads.
Live events for TV ads, they work.
Yeah, there will be no escape, and that's really the plan for the Jackson campaign. But the cascading effects of this are so interesting because it can have unintended consequences. Obviously, you want to get your message out there. You want to make sure you get it out everywhere all the time. That would be nice if you had $87 million. This has an effect of crowding out the space that's available for anybody else to run ads, including Republicans. And it also makes it more expensive for other candidates to buy ads once all of the reserved ad time is snapped up for political ads, then you have to kind of go into the buyer's market of just buying ad time that's not reserved for political spending.
And that's what we saw in the first round,
Yes.
too, right? It was really hard for down-ticket candidates to break through. Frankly, it was hard for candidates in the Democratic side to break through. You know,
yes.
a $2 million ad buy used to be a big deal in a primary. It was nothing compared to the hundreds plus millions of dollars that both Rick Jackson, Burt Jones, Brad Raffensperger, all of them are putting so much money behind ads. So it was hard for the Michael Thurmans of the world to get any attention with their ads.
Yeah, we definitely heard from Democratic candidates for governor saying they felt that Bottoms already had the advantage in name ID, and that was basically locked in at the beginning of the cycle. That advantage was because Rick Jackson was spending so much money, they could not only not really afford to spend as much money, they could not break through. There's already such a concentration of political ads. Once you have 15 seconds during a 3-minute window that's full of political ads, it's very hard for that to make a difference in the race that you're trying to run. And so Democrats and Republicans will find this. And we heard from people in Republican primaries saying, I got to find some other way to be heard because I can't drill a hole in this wall of Rick Jackson spending.
You know, it's new and it's not new because in 2022, we also had down-ticket candidates who were saying, look, all the focus is on Kemp versus Abrams and Herschel Walker versus Raphael Warnock. You know, I had talked to down-ticket candidates who were raising, you know, record numbers for their races. Who were like, no one really knows what we're doing. This is, though, even going to be magnified because, as you mentioned, the $87 million spend could just be the beginning. We're only talking TV. We're not talking all the other ways that Rick Jackson's campaign can use this money. And it was interesting, Patricia, because he was in Thomasville on Monday talking to voters about what this really could mean and what he could use this money for. And he said both things lead back incidentally to Mayor Andre Dickens, Mayor Bottom's successor in City Hall. He said he got off the phone with Mayor Dickens, and he said he feels like the mayor's done a really good job with leading Atlanta in the last few years. And he said, well, I'm spending some of that money to remind people of what it was like before Mayor Dickens was in City Hall with Keisha Lance Bottom's tenure. Of course, that we know that he's trying to make this race at least somewhat of a referendum on her record as Atlanta mayor. He said that, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have moved to Georgia since she last was mayor. So he'll be spending a lot of the money on that. But also he said that even Mayor Dickens didn't really know he was from Atlanta, didn't really know his backstory. So he said, somehow there are still people who don't know my story. And his polls show, his internal polls show, of course, the more people know about who he is, what his struggles as a child, the more they tend to drift towards him electorally.
Yes, he has a backstory that is really fully apart from politics. And people are so, I think in many cases, so tired of politics. They just gravitate towards something that feels like something they can either connect to or something that they can appreciate. So I think that's why his personal story is so powerful. It is wild to me. Two things. First of all, that Jackson called Andre Dickens. Mm-hmm. Now, we know there are plenty of Republicans he has not called yet. He has not called Burt Jones. As of last week, he had not called Josh McCoon. Mm-hmm. Maybe he's placed that call by now. But he's reached out to Mayor Dickens. That, as a sidebar, that's fascinating to me. As a part of that conversation, Dickens said, so where are you from? And he was like, I'm literally from Techwood Homes. I grew up in downtown Atlanta, but okay, well, maybe I need to add a little bit more to that ad buy. That apparently the mayor of Atlanta is unaware of where I grew up. Let's fix that. So yeah, we live and breathe this stuff. We know all about this. Your average bear not only is not paying attention, many cases they're trying to avoid knowing about this because the political space has gotten so combative and tumultuous. And I think that all candidates are dealing with the reality that people are actively tuning out politics because they just don't want to be a part of it.
Which brings us to this other interesting thing. And I know we'll be talking about this a lot. You know, we talk a lot about split ticket voters and we talk about, who those swing voters will decide upon. But the messages from both campaigns for governor and frankly for Senate too, they're focusing more as well on the base voters who just might tune all this out. And Republicans are more worried about those base voters than Democrats are. Democrats feel like their base voters are energized by their disdain for Donald Trump or you name it, the Republican policies a laundry list of things. But Republicans, I feel like, are increasingly worried that not the hardcore MAGA voters who've showed up every time Donald Trump's name is on the ballot. There's a concern about those folks too, because his name won't be on the ballot. But also your sort of more mainstream, mainline conservatives who, the battle might not be between Rick Jackson and Keisha Lance Bottoms. Of course, a lot of those folks would vote for Rick Jackson, but it's between Rick Jackson and the couch. It's trying to give them a motivating reason to vote. And I think that'll be a part of Rick Jackson's message in these ad campaigns and in his messaging on the campaign trail to these folks who are Republicans, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, but also might just be feeling what you just said, just wanting to tune everything out right now.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act for Jackson to need to do both things at the same time, to both motivate base voters because they've had, not the Jackson campaign, Republicans have seen this problem in the past. There is this real swing of enthusiasm with GOP voters when Donald Trump is not on the ballot. So they'll need to address that situation. At the same time, Jackson's campaign knows he must win over and reach out to middle-of-the-road voters, moderate Republicans, anti-Trump Republicans, independents, even some more moderate Democrats. And so because he has this much money, this is where it really starts to matter. He doesn't have to broadcast his message. He can narrowcast his message. He can have different tailored messages for your Fox News, your Newsmax, your MSNBC. I would not be totally surprised if we saw Rick Jackson pop up on MSNBC. He will have for the sports nuts, for the soccer moms, for the, two-parent working households. He's going to have a message for everybody, targeted at everybody, paid for everybody. So that's when this money really starts to matter. But it's crucial to point out that having the most money, just showering a state in cash, is not a guarantee that you're going to win. Tom Steyer out in California just spent $236 million. Frankly, Rick Jackson's on track to spend more than that, incredibly. And Tom Steyer is not going to be the next governor of California. There can also be a backlash. I've heard from a few Republican voters, and this shocked me, that who said, I was open to Jackson. I don't trust the fact that he's spending this much money. Like, why do you have to spend this much money? And they're voting for Keisha Lance Bottoms. I said, well, you're not going to vote for Keisha Lance Bottoms. They're like, I am.
Or they might stay home.
Yeah.
I asked Mayor Bottoms about this at an event that I covered on Monday. She said she calls Rick Jackson a gazillionaire. She doesn't even use the B word. She calls him a gazillionaire. But she said she was squeeze the most out of whatever she can spend. She said, quote, there's still a power of the megaphone. We're going to do what we need to do with what we have, whatever that amount is. I'm not surrendering. I won't have that much money, but I'm saying whatever we have, we're still going to take our case directly to the people of the state. So she is, I think even I've talked to Democrats close to her campaign who said even they were astounded by the sheer amount. I think some of them might have bought into the idea that Rick Jackson wasn't going to dig as deeply into his fortune, and certainly he's already sending signals that he's going to spend even more than he did maybe in the first round. We'll see. But I think that hit them like a ton of bricks, the sheer amount. Also, it'll be interesting to see this impact on the Senate race, because it will give Mike Collins an indirect lift. Rick Jackson might not show pictures of him and Mike Collins. I doubt he would, but he will be talking about the overall Republican agenda. This is what Republican strategist Chip Lake said. And Chip he knows what it's like to face a big spending rival. He was helping out Burt Jones's campaign. He was a key strategist for Herschel Walker. He was a key strategist for Doug Collins way back in 2020 when he faced the big spending Kelly Loeffler, who dipped deep into her own fortune to help self-finance her campaign. This is what Chip said. Trust me when I say this matters bigly. Midterms are always challenging for any party that controls the White House. This is a recognition that he's aware, that's Rick Jackson, of that, and bad news for any Georgia Democrat. So Chip's estimation, this will carry an impact also to the Senate race, but also all the way down the ticket. making it harder for Democrats to kind of push their message through.
Yeah, it also, I think it will also matter the message that Rick Jackson is putting out there among the many messages. We have seen the Ossoff and Bottoms campaign together as one. We have not seen the same thing from Rick Jackson and Mike Collins. Of course, it will benefit Mike Collins if Jackson presents himself as somebody who is broadly acceptable as a Republican, if he is kind of redefining the Republican brand post Brian Kemp in a way that can win over a majority of voters. That is very positive. But we have not seen that lockstep tag team between Jackson and Collins, and I don't expect to see it either. So anything that Collins gets out of this will be, I think, ancillary. It won't be direct. He's got his own brand and challenges to deal with, and he's going to have to buy his own ads with this huge onslaught, and he's going to face the same challenges as all these other Democrats and Republicans in the state, just trying to break through with their own message while Rick Jackson is dominating with his.
Stay tuned. That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. A reminder, if you've got a question you'd like to ask us, call our hotline anytime. Leave your question and we'll play it back and answer it right here during our Monday mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. YouTube viewers, welcome to our channel. Please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Whether you find us on YouTube or the podcast apps, we always appreciate your comments, ratings, and reviews. Also, your emails, politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. It helps others find the show and join our conversation. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia. And we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.